That one works.
Hello?
Excuse me.
There you are. You're okay now.
Hello, can you hear us? Right at the end there? Can you hear us? Good. Well, it's my great pleasure this evening to have Glenn Lowry, who's the director of the Museum of Modern Art and has written a range of books on history, one of the titles, Making History, Some Thoughts on Contemporary Art and the Middle East, one of the, a museum director who is deeply interested in writing and ideas. Welcome you here, Glenn. It's lovely to have you. Marc Quinn, leading artist of his generation, and he has a range of very critically acclaimed work, Siren, 2008, Alison Lapper Pregnant, 2005. He's shown in many international museums and galleries, including the Tate. Marc, great for you to be here with us. And William Kentridge, South African artist, is acclaimed for his drawings, films, theatre and opera productions. In fact, he was the Norton Professor of the Arts at Harvard last year, and when I introduced him there, I said that he covered all the various aspects of the Norton Professorship of the Arts. He was as much a theatrical person as he was a writer, as he's an artist, a photographer, an installation artist. So thank you for bringing your manifold gifts to us this evening.
Thank you.
Our friends, please give our panel a rousing welcome. Now, this session is called The Artist's Eye. And most of us associate art with the visual experience. Art is to be seen, and like music is to be heard. However, contemporary art is much more complex than that. If I might say this and use the language of the academy of the university, contemporary art is profoundly interdisciplinary. Every time I'm invited to speak to an art school, the dean says, please don't just speak about art, speak about all the other issues, the philosophical issues, the conceptual issues, all these things that contribute to the making of art. New technology has also changed the very basis of of art making. So I think my first question to our panelists is going to be, in what way is the artist's eye informed by things that are not visual, and how do they then contribute to the quality of the visual that we associate so intimately with the making of art? Glenn.
Well, I think if you use the idea of the artist's eye as a shorthand for the ways in which artists think and absorb information that's around them, and then convert that into ultimately something tangible, then the artist's eye is like a sponge. It's an attractor of information. It seeks anything that's interesting and then tries to combine it with other interesting ideas and possibilities. It's certainly not only about the visual, although I think in the end it's fundamentally engaged with the visual. But I have to tell this quick little anecdote because it has to do with, I think, the way some artists think. And years ago I was at a conference with Richard Serra and with Adam Gopnik. Richard Serra is an American sculptor, Adam Gopnik, an American critic who was then writing for The New Yorker. And Richard said something about looking at Picasso. And Adam said, well, Richard, you know, when you look at Picasso, you don't really understand what you're seeing. Richard said, don't tell me what I'm seeing. I'm an artist. I see with my eye. And I think one has to read into that artists see differently than the rest of us. And the eye becomes that shorthand for the way in which someone who spends their life thinking about art processes that art.
You know, this reminds me of a statement by Philip Guston, who said, "It is not that I paint what I see, but it is what I want to see that I paint." Would you, William, respond to that in some way?
I will. I'm feeling a little bit as if, like a specimen on the table, as if the eye is going to be removed and examined for what it contains and does. I think I can't really speak about the artist's eye in general, just about the processes that feel familiar to me. And the first thing I would say, it has to do about uncertainty of seeing, a lack of confidence. There are some artists who are very certain in their taste, in their judgment, in what they're seeing, in their evaluations of the marks they make or marks that other artists have made. And for me, it's always been about uncertainty and lack of confidence in my own eye. Firstly, there's a division which is very simple between the artist as someone who makes something and the artist who looks at what either he or someone else has made. There's a very clear kind of split that happens, which every artist or writer will know. The difference between the moment when you're drawing something and it all feels fine, you're in a rhythm, it looks good, you think it's fine, and you step back and you have a look at it and you say to yourself, as if to another person, that's still no good. You've got the shoulder all wrong, the nose is in the wrong place, go back and redo it, do it better. And then the other self steps forward and starts redrawing and redrawing, and again changes to the viewer trying to assess it. So there's a kind of always a very complete split between the making and the looking. And then the only hope is that at some stage when doing the looking, there's a moment of recognition. So it has to do with the eye as a recognizing instrument rather than an instrument of knowledge. That there's something that sits behind the eye, which the eye, even if you can't describe or draw what's entirely in front of you, you can recognize what it is that you make as it emerges. And I suppose it's that conversation between what your hand is producing, or what your art, what is being constructed in front of you, and what you recognize in it, and you do it. And I would say it's that eye that needs to surprise itself and discover it knows something it didn't think it knew, or didn't know that it knew. That is where the activity, for me, has its heart.
Marc.
Yeah, well, I think that certainly the eye is a sort of portal, isn't it? It's where...
A portal.
A portal. The world comes in.
I think you need to put the mic there.
The world comes in through your eye, or through your ears, or through speaking or looking, and then you process it as an artist. It's totally about, for me anyway, ideas, and then incarnating those ideas into a visual object that becomes an object of meditation. So in other words, when someone else looks at it through their eye, they start to go in an analogous process to the one that I went through to create the object. Although that process is never controlled. When you put an artwork into the world, it has its own life. So what I think I'm creating may not be what the artist's eye sees, may not be what everyone else's eye sees. So there's a kind of, there's a sense that you reflect in the world, that I always feel I'm making work for the world I live in, for this world, and for the future, and that the different people who look at it will have completely different ideas about it.
You know, I think this is a very interesting set of responses to my first question, because it raises issues not only about the process of making art, but the value of art. Now, one of the things very much associated with the visual identification of art, with art as a visual practice, as a visual experience, is the notion of pleasure and beauty. And we are always given the sense that whether you understand the work of art or not, somehow the pleasure or the beauty of it will come immediately to the eye in some way. Now, we know from a lot of contemporary art that that notion of beauty is not what it used to be. Let us try and explore the concept, because there's been a big comeback in aesthetics, in work around beauty. And I would like us to try and just understand what each of you sees as a value in the notion of the beautiful, or indeed no value in that notion. And Glenn, I turn to you here, not because you make judgments about other artists as to whether their work is beautiful or not, but because you're, as a museum director, you have to have a very particular eye, particularly as a museum director of MoMA, because you're building a whole history for the rest of us. When we come in there, we get a sense of what the movements of art are, what the history of art is. Does beauty play a part in this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think to banish beauty from thinking about art, it would be a tragedy. What has happened, however, is that notions of beauty have changed dramatically, especially over the 20th century, so that what used to be about a certain kind of sensuous, perhaps even overt, obvious dimension that gave a kind of self-reflective pleasure has given way, I think, to the idea of something that provokes and challenges the mind. That the pleasure one can derive from looking at art isn't because one can immediately understand it, but because it can be contradictory, it can be difficult, it can be even insulting, and still create a condition in which your mind is engaged and you learn something from it. And that process of querying, of investigating, of being confronted with the unfamiliar can produce a sense of beauty. Because what attracts us, and that of course is one of the definitions about beauty, what attracts us, I think, as sentient human beings, is thinking, is that capacity to wonder, to be uncertain. And those works of art that have the ability to make you uncomfortable with yourself, but not so frustrated as to give up, that compel you to explore emotions and ideas, forms and shapes that are unfamiliar, become the works of art that often are the most satisfying. And that sense of satisfaction is another dimension of beauty. So for me, when I think about beauty, and I do think about it a lot, it's not so much that something is immediately gratifying, but rather that it can create for me, and I hope for others, something that ultimately is very satisfying.
So beauty is a process, not a kind of immediate recognition of something giving. It can happen, but you're arguing more for beauty as a complicated process, which in a way goes back to what you said, Marc. Beauty is a process of a whole range of things being part of the making of the work, and then the analogy with the viewer, who when he sees the work or she sees the work, goes through that process again. William, do you have much truck with beauty?
I do. I have a very complicated relationship to it, in the sense that you look at a landscape such as the landscapes that you were talking about of the Indian miniature paintings, which have an immediate sense of beauty to me. I think of the great European landscape paintings and think, okay, that's a beautiful landscape. Those forests, the clouds, the shadows, the water. And then I think of the landscape around Johannesburg, which is very desolate and very desiccated and leached of color in the winter. And for a while I thought, what an ugly landscape I live in. And I'd been cheated of a beautiful landscape that one saw in paintings. And when I started drawing those landscapes, it really started as a revenge against the absence of beauty in those local landscapes. But in the process of drawing them, they became familiar. So suddenly, instead of seeing a power pylon as this ugly structure, I saw, well, here's a half-drawn drawing in the landscape. It's meeting the drawing halfway. The bits of abandoned civil engineering are drawings in themselves. There's a kind of a meeting. It's a landscape that calls to be turned into charcoal and paper. The burnt grass in winter is almost a charcoal drawing in itself. And so it changed. And so, in fact, show me the bleakest landscape outside Johannesburg and I find it fantastic. And I can't really say why it's, for me it feels beautiful in a way that is completely not a traditional sense of landscape beauty. And so I think there is a way in which absolute concepts like beauty are also very much learned concepts that shift and change. And I'm not sure if this is now a perverse interest in an ugly landscape, or if it is a re-seeing of the landscape that makes it beautiful, or if in a third way, one is making a drawing which can be beautiful of a reality which is ugly. When there are paintings of the guillotined heads that Jericho did, okay, these are hideous images of someone's head, but they are beautiful paintings. So there's also a shift in what happens between the transformation of the world onto the paper that's not completely clear or transparent where the boundaries and edges are.
Marc, beauty means something to you?
Well, I think it's what William just said. I completely agree with it. Beauty is continually changing. It's also very much a social construct in some ways, but it's also, I mean, many of the works I did were about that, like the sculpture of Alison Apper, the disabled woman, was about, what is a beautiful body? I was in the British Museum looking at the fragmented marble statues and all the tourists looking at them and, this is so beautiful. And I thought, well, if someone, a real person whose body was that shape was in this gallery, in all likelihood, the audience would have a feeling of not knowing what to do, not knowing how to react to this person. So I thought, well, if I made a marble statue of someone whose body was like that, what would happen? And what happened is that there seemed to be a way of creating a new sense of what might be beautiful. And I realized that really beauty is not only evolving, but it's a kind of collective thing. But then there's beauty in a way is something that stops, it's striking, it's something that stops time for a moment, that puts you in a sense of rapture maybe, that makes you question things, that is something that you've never seen before. And then secondly, just to finish on this, that after I'd done the Scotch Valley Snapper, I thought, well, what's the opposite of that? And the opposite is what everyone thinks is the most beautiful person in the world. And I chose, at that moment, Kate Moss, the model. I made a sculpture, but it was never of her. It was of the idea of the most beautiful person. So it was I'm really interested in the way which comes to beauty, that human beings create images and then let those images rule them without remembering that they created them in the first place. And it happened in religions with gods and goddesses. It's this sense that we love to create something bigger than ourselves, but then forget that we created it. And somehow beauty is involved in that too.
Yeah, what is so interesting here is that what you've all said about the changing nature of beauty and its social construction is in fact precisely what aesthetics, the aesthetic approach to art or to literature, is not simply about the beautiful, but the beautiful mixed with the ugly, the seductive mixed with the repulsive. That is what an aesthetic education is about. Why art or literature teaches you how to live and also teaches you how to be civic as a citizen. So I wanted to ask, but there's been something in your answers that has kind of spanned you. The beauty and its relationship to the person, beauty and its relationship to landscape. So I want to ask you something. Do you think that there was a time when nature was much closer, both conceptually and historically, to what people did in art, and that somehow the movement to minimalism, abstraction, and so on, has actually moved our vocabularies away from beauty? There was a time when the analog, the beautiful landscape, the beautiful person, the beautiful portrait, the beautiful sacred scene, beauty was immediately associatable. There were other things too. So when you work, and you at the Museum of Modern Art are immersed in contemporary art practices, both of you work in a very contemporary way, in a contemporary medium. That doesn't mean that you forget the past at all. In fact, it comes coming back to you. Don Quixote for you, William, keeps coming back in your horse images. But what I want to ask you is, do you think the shift to minimalism, abstraction, and so on, requires other words to be used. And what might these other evaluative words be? Let's start this time with William, and then get to Glenn. Oh, then to Mark, and then to Glenn. What other terms come to mind? Important for you.
Yeah. I mean, I was coming from Mumbai yesterday. It struck me that for the first time I understood a lot about Turner's paintings, because there is such thick, I think it is smog and fog over Mumbai, that the sun coming through the fog as it rises over the sea suddenly turns the air into the color and the look of Turner's paintings. Which
Wait
London
till you get to Delhi.
Well, with London's clean air, you no longer, it feels like a fantasy. And obviously those paintings were both, in one sense it was a kind of naturalism on Turner's part, on the other hand they're the strong influence and very much behind a lot of abstract painting that emerged in the 20th century. And I think that in almost all things which one thinks of as being new phenomenon, there are always antecedents, whether it's in the decorative arts that get enlarged and turned into minimalism, whether it is stylized, non-naturalist representations of nature which long predate the stylizations of earlier 20th century and later 20th century images of nature. So I don't think that the categories are different. I think they get given different importance in the same way that someone who was an artist in the 15th century was simply a craftsman and not given the elevated status that we have sitting on the stage here. So I think those things change, but the relationship of minimalism, abstraction, it's not as if these are new ways of seeing, looking at shapes, just looking at colors. These had been part of a much older vocabulary also.
Mark,
Yeah,
what would be the new vocabulary, evaluative vocabulary, like the spontaneous vocabulary, like beauty, or what would you suggest?
Well, I think that the idea that the art has become more minimalist, I think art world's like a pendulum, and it's gone to this extreme of minimalism, and I think that art is bringing real life back into art. I think that's one of the things one can see in contemporary art today, is bringing real issues and real things from the real world in, like William talking about drawing his landscape. And you've got to remember that nature was never one thing, and until the 18th century, people feared and hated mountains. They weren't seen as beautiful. They were seen as terrible places where you would never want to go. And it's only with the picturesque and the grand tour that people then started to see that there was a different kind of beauty. So really it's just this evolution. I guess people always want to challenge themselves. And the artist, first of all, you want to make something that challenges you and surprises you and think, oh my God, this is a new way of looking at the world. And then that moves things forward. And then perhaps your viewers agree with you or don't. But once you've made a work of art that looks at the world in a different way, you can't go back.
Right.
So it's a kind of continual, art is a continuum. Right. Even though we think contemporary art is completely different to the art before, in a way it's not.
Glenn, would you add, sorry, I'll come back to you in a minute. What are the new vocabularies you might add to evaluative vocabulary?
Well, I think if you look at this from a modestly historical perspective, a great deal of the 20th century was about unpacking beauty.
Unpacking.
So the advent around 1912 of abstraction, a process that sought to create another modality of image making that did not refer to nature, that consciously sought a break with anything mimetic and anything natural, caused a kind of chain reaction that you can trace relatively easily from the teens to the 20s to the 30s to the 40s to the 50s, right up to the 60s and the advent of conceptual and minimal art, all of which were posited as an exercise of the avant-garde. So the first thing that went in that exercise was the traditional monikers of description.
Yeah.
And hence, beauty became an ever more suspect term. associated with a historical past. It was replaced, I think, by constant seeking for radicality.
Radical.
And I would say that that was the driving thinking, certainly up through the 80s and maybe even into the early 90s. And then it was artists like William and Marc who actually didn't have to grapple with the same problems of minimalism and conceptualism, and could not only return to image making, but could return to image making on a new set of terms.
Right. So, can I ask each of you a much more direct personal question? If you had, at this moment in time, to choose one work to have on your mantelpiece, given that you all live in suburban homes with mantelpieces, what would you choose? Marc, one work, and something that comes to mind immediately. One word,
Immediately,
one word.
I would choose a Chola sculpture.
A Chola sculpture.
Yeah.
I would take one of the last 20 paintings that Manet did. They're tiny paintings of a few flowers stuck in a jam jar of water that he painted in the last 6 months of his life.
Lovely.
I would take a Cézanne turning at Montgeroux.
So three works. Can I ask you, again, your work, your original work was in Indian miniature painting, Persian and Indian miniature painting. Have you found connections between that and contemporary art practices of any kind? In terms of the flatness of that painting, the perspective, you know, the things you've written about?
What I think is interesting about miniature painting, let's say under the Moguls, is that it's a very formal process. It has in its own way a strongly conceptual dimension to it. So while the images may narrate a story, the means by which they're created and the means by which they're read actually is conceptual. And so it's not a surprise that a lot of Western artists, Bryce Martin, Howard Hodgkin, to just name two very quickly, found in Rajput and Mughal painting something deeply interesting. And it wasn't because they needed that to make their own art. It's because they found a kindred spirit, a kindred mode of thinking and seeing, if you want, the world. And I find it very easy to slip back and forth between my interests in particularly Mughal painting and my interest in contemporary art. When you ask, pick a single work of art, 30 seconds later I would have probably said one of Mansour's great bird paintings. And to me they're not separated, they're part of a continuous process by which artists are constantly investigating the world around them. And to that degree, Mughal painting is as fresh today for me as it was probably 500 or 400 years ago for an artist working in Mughal court.
Marc, you mentioned the Chola bronze, and I'd like you to talk about that choice and how it may speak to your own interests as an artist working in a very different milieu.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I spoke earlier about making these sculptures of the model Kate Moss, this idea of an abstraction, a model of an abstraction, I had been coming to India and looking at the great Cholas and loving this idea that they were really, in a way, God-shaped vessels that would be inhabited and then not inhabited, depending on whether they're consecrated or not and within the religious context. And it seemed to me this thing that by someone wanting something to be there, you bring it into being. And it felt that that was the same thing that happened in contemporary society with ideas of celebrity or ideas of perfection that one saw in the media, in magazines, in images, that they were sort of being inhabited by people's hopes and dreams in the same way as perhaps a Chola might be inhabited by the hopes and dreams of the devotee. And there was something about the abstraction and the kind of almost doll-like sense of these sculptures that I think fed into my work. Although it's about a very different thing in a very different time, it seemed that it kind of inspired me in that way. And I think the other thing, sorry, one more thing that you have to remember is the great thing about art is it doesn't need translation, unlike literature. You can look at an Indian sculpture without speaking any Indian language. An Indian person can look at a Japanese scroll, you know, it's a much more universal language. Although one may not understand the reasons why things were made, you can get an immediate, some spiritual something from it. Yeah.
See, I want to take that point about art not needing cultural translation, if I might just, and turn that to William, because in William's work, it seems to me, he uses a lot of African stuff, he uses materials, but there is, as I read it, William, a continual attempt to think about translation. How do I put this from this culture together with that from that culture? What are its limitations? What are its strengths? At least in, you know, reading your work and seeing it over, I think translation is something that very much concerns you.
I think yes, translation does interest me, but mistranslation interests me more than good translation. In the sense that I always think the most interesting work that comes from one tradition is work that is done in response to it by people who half understand it. So that Sterne is the best follow-up from Cervantes, and Gogol, who didn't read English, was the best follow-up from Sterne. The way in which one has a sense of something that is being done, but there are gaps and riddles, and those very gaps and riddles of not having full comprehension are what provoke the imaginative leaps to make a possible sense of it. And so that I think we're also very flexible of, even if we don't have the insider knowledge of a city, a country, a culture, when we look at a picture or read a book, we're constantly imagining what it could be, what it could possibly have meant, how it could have come into being. And I think that, for me, certainly as an artist, it is an essential, vital leap that we make. And for me, it's also important that that which is made as an artist is simply emblematic of what we all have to do to make sense of the world as we go through it. Try to construct the complete story of something imperfectly understood, where there are just fragments given which we have to make sense of overall.
One final question before we open up to the audience. What do you make of biennales and art fairs? We're about to have the Delhi Art, I don't know, do they call it the Art Fair? No, they call it something much more dignified than that. I think they call it the Art something or the Art Summit. So we're about to have the Art Summit. Biennales are all around the world. What is this phenomenon? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it neither? Is it wonderful? Is it an exploration? Is it a bazaar? I would ask you to go with that one, Glenn.
It's all of the above. I mean, I think I can only imagine that from an artist's perspective, it must be as close to hell as you can get.
An auction's worse.
Auction's worse. Secondary market.
But from a spectator's point of view, especially if you're interested in seeing a great deal of art in a relatively condensed time frame, especially in unfamiliar circumstances, they're very useful. The problem with them, especially the biennial, and I think art fairs and biennials are actually somewhat different issues, although they tend to merge at a certain point. But the problem with the biennial is that it has become an exhibition form that every city now wants to have, almost more as a means of cultural establishment than because there's a genuine interest in the art. So you then get a kind of festival production. Artists who, even if they don't want to, end up being compelled to make certain kinds of installations in art simply because that's what's needed and demanded by certain types of biennials. Not every artist, not every biennial falls into this problem. But if you go around to enough biennials, and I certainly do, there's a sameness that starts to emerge that I think is deeply problematic. The countervailing side of that is what I see as sameness, because I've been to Guangzhou and to Singapore and to Venice and to Sao Paulo, in the local circumstances of Sao Paulo, may be actually seriously important, because it is the introduction of works of art and artists into a local condition that might not otherwise be there. And I think there's a fertilization, if you want to call it that, that's the countervailing premise to the sameness that also exists. The art fair is a meat market, pure and simple. Useful for collectors, as I said, I suspect dreadful for artists, and mildly interesting for curators. But if you move the next step from that as a cultural phenomenon, I think they're fascinating, because at least in the United States, a decade ago or 25 years ago, cities that wanted to place themselves on the map would have done so by bringing a sports franchise to town. That would be the way for a city to assert its civic pride. Today, actually, bringing a biennial or an art fair to town is a means of competing and placing oneself within some larger international network of, quote, successful cities. And that's a new phenomenon.
I think that, for me, the key thing about the we had a Biennale in Johannesburg, where I live, twice, and then it was stopped. And we now have an art fair, which is a sadness, but certainly better than nothing happening in the town. But there was an astonishing relief. As someone who in the 1980s had packed up a portfolio and gone from Johannesburg to the centers and knocked on the doors of galleries with the portfolio under your arm, you cannot help but have the feeling you are the peasant arriving at the gates of the castle, hoping to be let in. And it's an astonishingly humiliating process to understand that relationship of the cultural center to the peripheries. And so when the first and second Johannesburg Biennale came, when suddenly curators came to Johannesburg, when there was an interest in work that happened outside the centers of the United States and Europe, that was an astonishing opening, certainly for me personally. That's how my work was first seen and seen outside of, invited to be seen outside of South Africa. But for many artists, to feel that people had made the journey to actually understand or come and visit their context, to go to studios, to see it in that way, to understand that the world didn't stop, as it had until the 1980s. The art world stopped at the gates of New York, Paris, Berlin, and London. And if you wanted to be an artist and be talked about in the art world, you had to bring your pots and pans and use and pay what was always, in the most disgusting term, always used in New York particularly, you had to, what they called, pay your dues. As if indeed you were a peasant coming with your tithe you had to hand over before you were allowed to be part of the public body. So there is a sense in which biennales, particularly in Havana, in Johannesburg, in Sao Paulo, absolutely also assertions of trying to establish a different way in which art could be seen in the world. And I think that has changed. The way in which what is seen as art making in the world is different. And there are thousands of artists whose work is now looked at and spoken about and understood. And this is part of coming back to the beginning, changing the notion of what is the beautiful is no longer simply a received opinion from the center sent out to the periphery.
Marc, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think really echoing what these guys have said, that it's not wholly good, it's not wholly bad. In a way, it increases an awareness of contemporary art, it increases an audience, increases where people think about art, and that can only be a good thing. But it really brings up, especially the fair, the whole thing of the relationship between art and commerce, which is a whole subject we haven't really talked about, which is the kind of the kind of demon in the shadow of the art world, is the brutality of the market. And, you know, fairs I think are actually okay to go to, but an auction, for instance, is much more the pure thing of that. Yeah. But real art doesn't exist. It exists in a separate place to that. So,
Right.
yeah.
So, I've played my pack of cards. You've answered my questions wonderfully. Thank you very much. Let's get a view from the audience for the next 10 minutes. Yeah, can we have a mic here, please? Please, my friends, can you keep your questions
No,
brief?
you had to tell him that was saying Q&A.
Now, I'm Dr. Yusuf Azmi. You have been discussing about beauty. There is a saying, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. And also, we do discuss about the social construct, the changing phenomenon of beauty and other things, of you take in another perspective, rural and urban situations. So I think you cannot define beauty, only you can describe, and that description will be subject to change in time.
Thank you very much for your contribution, sir. Can we have a question, please?
So what is the visual rehabilitation to an artist who has lost his eye?
Thank you.
And what is it for the one who has lost to see it?
Thank you, my friend. One question at a time. Unfortunately, there are too many people here. Yes, this lady here in the front. Should we take a couple of minutes?
Yeah, this is actually about the curator's eye, really. I just want to ask Greg specifically about the exhibition Motorcycle at MoMA, which generated a whole lot of controversy. It was the most popular exhibition ever, but it generated controversy. So is that art?
Well, it was at the Guggenheim rather than the Museum of Modern Art. But as somebody
And for that reason, it might not have been art.
but as someone who loves speed and motorcycles, I still remember the King of Spain's Ducati, which was at the bottom of the spiral. And I'm not sure whether it was art or not, but I really wanted to try riding it.
You've discussed the problems faced by 14th, 15th, 16th century writers. I'm here.
This way?
Sir?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think censorship is one of the problems faced by the 20th century writers? And who decides what is to be censored and what is to be published or what is to be shown?
Right.
Your views on this?
I think the question of censorship is that there had been censorship at various different times for various different reasons. Is there something you want to say about art and censorship?
Not in this discussion. I don't.
South Africa?
I mean, I think it starts a whole different discussion, which is an interesting one, but not what we should be focusing on.
Can we have somebody from the back of the room, the middle of the room? Yeah. Yes, this gentleman here with the plaid scarf on. Yes, the Scottish scarf. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for saying that. Could you reflect on art and the artist's personal life and how both changes along while making the art?
You want to be confessional? You want to be confessional? You don't?
I can't really think of an art. Well, I mean,
say something scandalous about yourself. Otherwise, it's not interesting.
Yeah, I have to think of something.
Yeah, all right. Let's move on to the next. Yes, there's a lady here.
I had a question for everyone, actually, whether it's from the curator's point of view or the artist's point of view. Do you think if the spectator, it may be anyone, if their interpretation or their perception of the art piece, or maybe the entire gallery, is different from the thoughts, as you said, the ideas or what the visual eye saw initially, if it's different from that and they, but they have that reaction, do you consider it a successfully curated gallery or a successful piece of art?
Well, sorry, is the question that the person who comes in, who looks at the work or who experiences the show, has a very different response from what you intended?
Yeah. Does it make it successful?
Does it make it successful or unsuccessful? Mr. Mistranslation, you would think it makes it successful.
I think there are certain interpretations of work which you hear, which ring a bell and suddenly make you see the work or see things in what you've done in a different way. And there are certain ones which are maybe fine for the viewer, but which ring no bells. It's not to say they are completely off the ball. They may have particular associations. It's always a meeting between what the artist has put onto the paper and what the viewer projects onto it. And that membrane between projection and reception is where the work always happens.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. So, like art is a constant process of evolution in a way. And when an artist is, let's say, new to the world and he wants his work to be recognized and he wants his, work to be, in a way he has to sustain, so he needs his work to sell. And just as you said that the client has certain demands, so in a way the work sort of gets influenced by that. So is it so that the concept of evolution gets hampered, as an art is getting hampered because of commercialization nowadays?
Are you evolving, Marc?
Hopefully I'm evolving. I hope the whole world's evolving, and that,
Towards the market?
Towards the future, towards something
utopian, something great.
Everything changes all the time, and we're all part of it.
Okay. Evolution in art?
Well, change in art, but I think the one thing to try to anticipate what other people want or see or understand is always a bad idea. One's very inaccurate at doing it. People always understand more than you expect. They make different connections. Trying to paint pictures that other people think you're going to do very seldom works.
You've got to do things for yourself, essentially, and then if someone else likes it, that's a plus.
Yeah. Right, the gentleman with the white jacket.
This is to the panel in general. Following on from Damien Hirst, I understand in China that artists have put human foetus in formaldehyde. Now, is this really art, or is this just an attempt to shock for shock's sake?
Human what?
Human fetus.
Human foetus.
Fetus.
Fetus, yeah.
Foetus, must be German. Is anyone moved by this question?
I don't know anything about this art. I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it.
Same.
I haven't seen it. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen it, but from Duchamp onwards, when something is placed in the context of art, then it becomes art. That says very little. All it says is that you can talk about it as art. It doesn't say it's interesting, good, bad. But the urinal, you may as well have the fetus as the urinal. The urinal changed how one has to talk about what things constitute art.
I have only two questions, very quick ones. One there and one here. Woman here, stand up please. Woman with the spotted scarf. Give her a mic. All right, yes, you, at the back. Yeah.
Me? Yeah. You've talked about the relationship between beauty and pleasure, but there is also an obvious, relationship between beauty and the political. Things like Guernica or Goya's etchings, the disasters of war. So what kinds of beauty are being created in these works?
I don't know whether either Goya or Picasso was grappling with problems of beauty in their work. They were grappling with a completely different set of issues, whether today, conditioned by having looked at their work for a century or more, we can now see something beautiful in them, is a different story from what their intention was. And I think actually if we read those works simply as beautiful, we miss their underlying scorching indictment of horror.
I think one would use, I think that's right, I think that one would use other kind of superlative words that are allied to beauty but not identical to it. You would say casually, have you seen those fantastic, those remarkable, those astonishing etchings of Goya? To simply say those beautiful etchings, you might say they are so terrible but they're also so beautiful. And there is a terrible beauty in Guernica and in those. And it has to do with understanding that meeting of the world, the terrible part of the world of both Guernica and the disasters of war, together with the astonishing understanding transformation done through the hand, through the etching, through the painting, through the rearranging of space in Guernica or the disasters of war. And there is a celebration, however horrific the images, there's a celebration of the activity of what the artist has done in that which we participate in as a viewer. It's not to say I could have done those disasters of war, but there is something about understanding a fellow person having put that labor, that skill, that imagination and that pain into that work which you then hold in your hand or see on the wall. And it's in that communion that I think there is a an understanding both of terror and beauty as fitting together at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think a truly great work of art can often oscillate between repulsion and attraction. And it's a kind of sense of recognition or of a truth when you look at the work, that you see a truth in it and you're moved by that truth, and we could call that a beautiful moment. But it's not beauty in a picturesque sense.
I think, dear friends, we've got to come to an end, but the takeaway, as they say, the takeaway from this session, I think, is the notion of relations. The beautiful and the ugly work together. So any notion of beauty as being separated from the ugly, or any notion of the seduction being separated from repulsion, is too simple in the world of art. We've also been talking about various ways in which the arts of different countries and cultures can actually come together and pull together. We have tried to talk about new vocabularies of art that go with new forms of art. And I want to thank you in the audience for your excellent questions. I want to thank my panelists for being so wonderfully collaborative. Thank you all very much. Thank you.